The first snow of winter had not yet fallen when Roscoe Brooks finally set down his carving knife, pressed his roughened palm flat against the smooth seat of the rocking chair, and allowed himself, for the first time in 4 months, to breathe. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the hill country of central Texas, where the live oaks stubbornly held their color while everything else surrendered to the season. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat in a shallow valley between two limestone ridges, small enough that everyone knew each other's business, and large enough that people could still pretend otherwise. There was a general store, a church without a proper steeple, a livery stable that smelled of cedar shavings and old manure, a saloon called the Silver Bit, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and a post office that was really just a room off the back of the general store. There was also a hotel of sorts, 4 rooms above the dry goods establishment, and a small doctor's office that was rarely used because the nearest doctor of any real reputation lived 30 miles east in the town of Fredericksburg. Roscoe Brooks had come to Harlan's Crossing 3 years prior, in the spring of 1871, with little more than a good horse, a saddle, a bedroll, and a reputation for being the best fence-line rider in the hill country. He was 26 years old when he arrived, quiet-natured and careful with his words, the kind of man who watched a room before he entered it and never sat with his back to a door. He was not handsome in any classical sense, but there was something in his face, a kind of earnest steadiness that made people trust him instinctively. His jaw was square and perpetually shadowed with stubble. His dark eyes were set wide apart and carried a warmth that surprised people who expected hardness from a man of his occupation. And his hands were enormous, calloused objects that could nonetheless handle a newborn foal with extraordinary gentleness. He had taken work at the Caldwell Ranch, which sat on 3,000 acres of hill country grassland northwest of town, and he had proved himself indispensable in a matter of weeks. Old man Caldwell, who was 62 and had worked cattle all his life, said he had never seen a man read the land the way Roscoe Brooks did. Roscoe could look at a stretch of fence line and tell you where the deer had been crossing, where the water was pooling underground, and exactly where the next post was going to rot before it showed any visible sign of weakness. He became the ranch's head hand within 6 months and had occupied the bunkhouse at the west edge of the property ever since, a solitary arrangement that suited him perfectly. Nellie Lockhart came to Harlan's Crossing in the summer of 1873, which was 1 year and several months before the autumn that would change both of their lives entirely. She arrived on a stage from San Antonio, a widow of 23 years old, carrying 2 trunks and a hat box and the particular kind of composed dignity that people wear when they have survived something devastating and refuse to let it flatten them. Her husband, Thomas Lockhart, had been a surveyor who died of a fever contracted during a mapping expedition in the southern brush country. They had been married only 14 months. There had been no children. Nellie had been left with a modest inheritance that was enough to purchase the small house on the south end of Harlan's Crossing's Main Street, and perhaps enough to run it for 2 years if she was careful. She had come to Harlan's Crossing specifically because her late husband's cousin, a woman named Ada Prout, lived there and had written to Nellie 3 times encouraging her to come. Ada ran the general store with her husband, Clayton, and had made it plain that there was work available if Nellie wanted it and community available if Nellie needed it. Nellie, who was nothing if not practical, had packed her trunks and come. She was a woman of medium height with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely during the day, and that fell in long waves when she let it down at night. Her eyes were gray, the color of river stone after rain, and they had the quality of seeing more than they let on. She had grown up in Kentucky, the daughter of a school teacher, and she had read enough books to know that the world was larger and stranger and more beautiful than the particular corner of it she had been assigned. She had a laugh that she was slightly embarrassed by because it was larger than she intended it to be, a full-bodied, unguarded sound that seemed to startle her every time it escaped. Roscoe first saw Nellie Lockhart on a Tuesday morning in August of 1873, when he rode into town for supplies and found her on the front porch of the general store, arguing pleasantly but firmly with Clayton Prout about the weight of a sack of flour. "That is not 20 pounds, she was saying, standing with one hand on her hip and the other holding the mouth of the sack open so Clayton could see inside it. "That is closer to 16, and I am not suggesting you are dishonest, Clayton. I am simply suggesting that your scale requires adjustment." Clayton, who was a good-natured man but habitually inattentive, was nodding and looking faintly baffled. Roscoe tied his horse at the rail and stepped up onto the porch, and Nellie glanced at him briefly, the way you glance at any stranger who enters a scene, and then returned her attention to the matter at hand. "Roscoe," Clayton said in the tone of a man grateful for any distraction, "tell the lady here that my scale is calibrated properly." "I have never once checked your scale, Clayton," Roscoe said. He looked at the sack. He looked at Nellie. "But I will say that sack does look light." Nellie pressed her lips together to contain a smile. She did not quite succeed. Roscoe felt something shift in his chest, a very small movement like a door swinging open just a crack. "I am Nellie Lockhart," she said, extending her hand with the directness of a woman who had decided early in life that convention was less important than efficiency. "I am Ada's cousin by marriage." "Roscoe Brooks," he said, and shook her hand, and that was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have been able to say so at the time. They did not become friends quickly. Nellie was careful and Roscoe was reserved, and the social geography of a small town like Harlan's Crossing meant that their paths crossed regularly but not intimately. He would tip his hat to her on the street. She would nod when he came into the store where she had begun working 3 days a week alongside Ada. They would occasionally find themselves at the same Sunday service or the same seasonal gathering at the schoolhouse, and they would exchange the kind of polite, substantive conversation that passes between two thoughtful people who have not yet found the specific occasion to become something more to each other. It was in the spring of 1874, 9 months after Nellie had arrived in Harlan's Crossing, that things began to change. There had been a late freeze that came without warning and killed off half the kitchen gardens in town, including Nellie's. She had planted those seedlings herself, had spent 2 weekends in March carefully preparing the soil behind her small house, and the loss of them hit her harder than she expected. She was standing behind her house the morning after the freeze, looking at the blackened remains of what had been promising little green shoots, when Roscoe rode past on his way to the ranch. He pulled up his horse without thinking much about it. "Rough luck," he said. "I keep telling myself it is only plants," Nellie said. She did not look at him. She was still looking at the garden. "And yet here I am, standing here as though someone has died." There was a long pause. A mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire somewhere in the cedar trees at the edge of her property. "There is a woman over on the Medina River Road," Roscoe said after a moment. "Name of Mrs. Vasquez. She has seedlings she starts indoors every year and she always has extras. She sold some to Caldwell's cook last year when the same thing happened." Nellie turned and looked at him then. "Does she mind visitors?" "She likes them," he said. "I could take you out there Saturday if you wanted." "It is about 4 miles east." Nellie considered this for a moment. "That is very kind of you," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, which told him something, though he could not have said precisely what. They went on that Saturday, driving out in the ranch's small buckboard that old man Caldwell let him borrow, and Mrs. Vasquez, who was a generous and talkative woman of 50-something who had been in Texas since before statehood, pressed so many seedlings on them that they barely had room for both of them and the plants in the buckboard on the way home. Nellie laughed at the abundance of it, genuinely laughed, and that was the first time Roscoe heard her full laugh, the one she was embarrassed about, and it was in that moment that the door that had been swinging gently open since the flour sack argument finally came fully off its hinges. They talked all the way home. Nellie told him about Kentucky, about her father's schoolhouse and the particular smell of chalk dust and wood smoke, about learning to read at 3 years old because she was relentless about it and her father had found that charming rather than alarming. She told him about coming to Texas with Thomas, about how different it was from anything she had expected, wilder and more beautiful and more lonely all at once. She did not talk about Thomas's death directly, but he was present in what she said around it, the way a particular kind of silence can hold the shape of something that is no longer there. Roscoe told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's small farm, and the way the land there was soft and green compared to the limestone hardness of the hill country. He told her he had come south after his father died, and that he had found something in the Texas hills that he could not quite name, something that felt like the landscape had been waiting for him specifically. He told her about the cattle, about the peculiar satisfaction of fence line work, about the way a well-ridden horse and a man who understood each other could move across open land in a way that felt like the closest thing to freedom he had ever encountered. "I did not expect you to say things like that," Nellie said. "Like what?" "Like a man who thinks about things," she said, and then looked at him sideways to see if he was offended. He was not offended at all. He was something else entirely. "You expected a man who does not think about things." "I expected a man who talks about cattle and weather," she said frankly. "I can talk about cattle and weather too," he offered. "I am sure you can," she said, and she was smiling, and the buckboard rolled on through the spring afternoon with all those little seedlings between them, and everything was beginning. Through the rest of spring and into early summer, they found more and more occasions to be in each other's company. It was never anything that anyone could have pointed to as a formal courtship, not at first. He came to help her repair the back fence when one of the posts rotted and fell, because he was a man who repaired fences, and she mentioned it in passing. She brought food to the ranch at Old Man Caldwell's invitation when the cook fell sick for a week, and Roscoe was the one who showed her where things were kept in the kitchen, and who sat up talking with her after supper for 3 consecutive evenings while the old man retired early. On the third evening, they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching a summer storm build in the west, that particular Texas phenomenon where the sky turns a color between green and gold, and the air goes perfectly still before the thunder begins. The first lightning forked down behind the far ridge, silent and distant. "I used to be afraid of storms," Nellie said. "When I was small, I would put my head under my pillow and just wait." "What changed?" he asked. She thought about it. "My father took me outside during one, stood me on the porch and held my shoulders and said, 'Look, Nellie, just look at it.' And I did. And it was so enormous and so far beyond anything I could influence that being afraid of it seemed almost arrogant. Like I thought it was about me." Roscoe turned his head and looked at her. The storm light was unusual and it was making everything look slightly unreal, a little too vivid, the way the world looks sometimes just before it changes. "You are the most interesting person in Harlan's Crossing," he said. It came out without his planning it, plainly and directly, the way honest things do when a man has stopped guarding himself. Nellie was quiet for a moment. The thunder arrived then, a long, low roll that came from so far away it barely sounded like thunder, more like the earth clearing its throat. "You should be careful saying things like that," she said finally, and her voice was soft and not quite steady. "Why?" She looked at her hands in her lap. "Because I have been a widow for almost 2 years and I have been very responsible about it, very careful, and it would be easy to let someone undo that carefulness." She paused. "You, specifically, would be easy to let undo it." The admission sat between them in the storm-lit air, enormous and fragile. Roscoe looked at her profile, at the way the green-gold light caught the edge of her hair and the line of her cheek, and he understood that this was a moment that required the same quality of stillness he applied to the most delicate ranch work, the kind where a wrong move means everything falls apart. "I am not trying to undo anything," he said carefully. "I would not rush you. But I want you to know that when you are ready to stop being careful, I will be here." She looked at him then, all the way at him, those gray eyes direct and searching and a little overwhelmed. "That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," she said. He nodded once, and they sat there as the storm moved in, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, and it was one of the most comfortable silences either of them had ever sat inside. It was on a July evening in 1874, some 6 weeks after that conversation on the ranch porch, that Nellie said the thing about the rocking chair. They were at Ada and Clayton's house for a small supper, the kind of informal gathering that Ada organized every few weeks because she believed firmly that civilization depended on people sharing food. There were 6 of them at the table: Roscoe and Nellie, Ada and Clayton, and a schoolteacher named Mr. Hartley who boarded with the Pruitts and was engaged to a young woman named Jessie Cole who sat beside him looking pleased with everything. After supper they moved out to Ada and Clayton's front porch, which was one of the finest porches in Harlan's Crossing, wide and deep with a good view of the street, and Ada had on it a pair of cane-backed rocking chairs that she was particularly proud of. Nellie sat in one of them and rocked slowly, and there was something in her face as she settled into it, a kind of deep, quiet contentment. "Ada," she said, "where did you get these chairs?" "Clayton's uncle made them," Ada said, settling into the other one. "He was a furniture maker in Georgia before he came west. Gave us a set as a wedding present." Nellie ran her hands along the armrests. The wood was smooth from years of use, and the chair had the particular quality of an old well-made thing. It did not creak or wobble but moved in a long, gentle arc that felt like breathing. "I have always dreamed of having a rocking chair like this," Nellie said, and she said it the way people say things that come from somewhere deep and specific, not idle chatter but real feeling. "My grandmother had one. I used to sit in it when I visited her as a child and she would tell me stories. It was the most peaceful I ever felt as a girl." She paused. "I suppose a rocking chair is a small thing to dream about." "There is nothing small about a thing that gives you peace," Ada said. Roscoe was sitting on the porch rail, which was where he generally sat because the chairs always seemed too small for him, and he preferred the rail anyway. He was looking at Nellie in the rocking chair, the way the last of the summer evening light fell across her, the small unconscious smile on her face as she rocked. He did not say anything, but he filed it away in the careful way that he filed everything that mattered to him, deep and exact and permanent. He thought about it again on the ride back to the ranch that night. He thought about the thing Ada had said. There is nothing small about a thing that gives you peace. He thought about Nellie's face in that rocking chair. He thought about the fact that the summer was moving toward August and August would become September and September would be autumn, and he had a long autumn ahead of him with the slow ranch work of the cooler season, and he was the kind of man who used his hands when he was thinking. He had some skill with wood. Not exceptional skill, not the kind that furniture makers train for years to develop, but competent, careful skill. His father had kept a woodworking bench in the barn, and had taught Roscoe to use it from the time he could hold a plane steady. He had made serviceable things over the years: a small table, some shelves for the bunkhouse, a feed trough that was better than it needed to be. He had never attempted a rocking chair. He found a book. It took him 2 weeks to find it, a worn and water-stained volume on furniture construction that a man named Beaumont, who had been a carpenter in Virginia before the war, was willing to sell him for 50 cents out of the box of miscellaneous volumes he kept at the back of his workshop. The section on rocking chairs was 8 pages long and included diagrams that had partially run from the water damage, but were still legible if you turned the page at the right angle in good light. He read it 3 times. He read it the way he read the land, looking for the logic underneath the surface, trying to understand not just what the steps were but why they were in that order, what each cut was meant to accomplish, how the balance of the rockers created the motion that Nellie had looked so peaceful inside of. He did not tell anyone what he was planning. He was not a man who talked about things before they were done. September came to the hill country the way it always did in that part of Texas, which was to say that it looked like summer right up until the morning it suddenly did not. And then the quality of the light changed and the air carried something new in it, and you knew without being told that the season had turned. The cedar trees did not change, but everything else did, subtly, the grasses going gold at the tips, the sumac coming into its red, the days still warm but the evenings carrying a real coolness that settled in the hollows first and then spread up the hillsides. Roscoe had located on the south end of the Caldwell property a cedar elm that had come down in a summer storm, dead but not yet punky, the wood still sound and workable. Cedar elm was not the traditional wood for furniture, but it was what he had access to, and it had a tightness of grain and a hardness that he thought would serve. He cut sections of it over 3 days, carrying them back to the bunkhouse and stacking them to assess what he had. He had built a small lean-to against the back of the bunkhouse in his first year at Caldwell's ranch, a covered outdoor workspace with a southern exposure that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Old man Caldwell had raised an eyebrow when he built it but said nothing, because the finished fence-line logs and tool handles that had begun emerging from that space more than justified the square footage it occupied. On the first Saturday of September, with the first real autumn morning sitting cool and clear over the hill country, Roscoe Brooks brought his diagrams and his cedar elm wood to his lean-to bench and began. The first thing to understand about carving a rocking chair, as the book explained it, was that everything depended on the rockers. The 2 curved pieces at the base were not an afterthought but the fundamental structural logic of the entire piece. The angle of their curve determined the motion. The length of them determined the stability. The point where the legs met them determined the center of gravity. If you got the rockers right, the rest of the chair would follow. If you got them wrong, no amount of craftsmanship in the rest of it would correct the flaw. Roscoe spent the first 2 weeks of September on nothing but the rockers. He worked mornings before his ranch duties began and evenings after supper, sitting in the amber light of an oil lamp when the sun was gone, shaping the curves with a drawknife and then a spokeshave, testing the symmetry by eye and by feel, and by the small tricks the book described. He broke the first rocker on the 4th day, when a hidden stress crack in the wood ran out under the draw of the blade, and he sat with the 2 pieces in his hands for a long moment, feeling the familiar small anger of a setback, and then set them aside and cut new stock. The second pair of rockers came out right. He knew it when he set them on the ground and looked at them, the curve clean and even, the symmetry near enough to perfect that only a very precise instrument would have caught the difference. He ran his thumb along the inside edge of the curve, and it was smooth, not glassy smooth but the kind of smooth that has texture and life in it. He kept working. He saw Nellie on Saturdays, usually, when he came into town for supplies or when there was some social occasion. He was careful about how much he saw of her, not because he wanted to see less of her, but because he was aware of the things she had said on that porch in June about being careful, and he did not want to press. He also, in some private part of himself, understood that the chair he was making was a kind of declaration, and that once it was done, once he gave it to her, things would change between them irrevocably, and he wanted that to happen at the right time, not before it was ready. But he could not stay entirely away from her, and did not really try. She came to the ranch twice in September, once to deliver a letter for old man Caldwell from his son in San Antonio, which she had taken in at the store, and once simply because she and Ada had decided to ride out, and Ada's primary destination happened to be the Caldwell Ranch. Roscoe was aware of how thin those pretexts were and was grateful for them. On the second visit, a Saturday afternoon in mid-September when the light was doing something extraordinary on the hills, casting that particular autumn gold that makes everything look as though it is made of warmer, better material than it actually is, Nellie found him at his lean-to bench while Ada went inside to find Clayton, who was meeting with old man Caldwell about a land matter. Roscoe heard her footsteps on the packed dirt behind him and turned. He had been working on one of the back posts, which required a long, careful taper, and he had a tool in his hand. "I did not mean to interrupt," she said, stopping a few feet away and looking at the bench. "You are not interrupting," he said. She looked at the wood on the bench, at the various pieces and parts of the project arrayed in a deliberate order that made sense to him if not to a casual observer. She did not ask what it was. He was grateful for that too. He turned the back post in his hands, running his thumbnail along the taper to check its evenness. "You are a careful worker," she observed. "It does not go well otherwise," he said. She leaned her shoulder against the post of the lean-to and watched him work for a moment, and there was nothing uncomfortable in it. No need to fill the silence with talk, which was one of the things he had come to value most about her company. She was not a woman who was afraid of quiet. "Roscoe," she said after a while. "Nellie," she looked at him directly with those stone-gray eyes. "I would like to stop being quite so careful," she said. She said it the same way she said most things, plainly and without excessive preamble. "I have been thinking about what you said in June, about being here when I was ready." She paused. "I believe I am ready." Everything in the world seemed to become very precise and still for a moment, the way it does when something important is happening. A scrub jay called once from the live oak at the edge of the yard. The warm September air moved past them, carrying the smell of cedar and dry grass. Roscoe set down the piece of wood in his hands. He looked at her fully, the way you look at something when you want to remember it exactly as it is. "I am glad to hear that," he said. His voice was steady, but something in it was not, something underneath the steadiness. She smiled then, the real smile, not the controlled, polite one she kept for general use, but the one that involved her whole face. "That is a very restrained response," she said. "I have a lot of things I could say," he told her. "I just do not know the right order for them." "There is no right order," she said. "Just say them." He was quiet for a moment. The scrub jay called again. He picked up the back post and then set it down again, because he needed his hands to not be holding anything. "I have thought about you every day since that first morning by the flour sacks," he said. "That is probably not surprising to you by now. I think most things I have done in the past year have had you somewhere in the reasoning behind them, even when they did not seem to." He stopped. "I am not good at this kind of talk." "You are doing extremely well," she said, and her voice had gone soft. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you will permit it, call on you in the evenings. Sit on that porch of yours. See if what I think is between us is what is actually between us." "I believe it is what is actually between us," Nellie said. "But I would like the sitting on the porch very much." He nodded. She nodded. It was the least romantic physical exchange imaginable, two people nodding at each other in a woodworking lean-to on a September afternoon, and it was entirely perfect. Ada found them 20 minutes later standing at the edge of the lean-to looking at the hills, close enough to each other that their arms were touching, talking about nothing in particular with the ease of two people who have just removed a very significant tension from the air between them. Ada looked at the two of them, looked at Roscoe's arm against Nellie's arm, and allowed herself a very small and private smile before calling out that Clayton was done with his meeting, and they ought to be heading back to town. And so the courtship began in the middle of September, 1874, while autumn was settling in properly and Roscoe was spending every spare hour of his evenings in the lean-to behind the bunkhouse. He called on her on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, riding the 5 miles into town after supper, and arriving at her house on the south end of the main street in the last of the daylight. She would have the porch lamp lit, and sometimes there would be coffee, and sometimes there would be pie, because she had discovered that he had a weakness for any kind of pie that she found extremely useful as a tool for general goodwill. They sat on her porch in the wooden chairs she had there, 2 plain ladder-back chairs with no cushions, serviceable but not comfortable in any particular way, and they talked. They talked with the thoroughness and the appetite of two people who have been holding back a great deal and have finally decided not to. She told him everything about her childhood in Kentucky, the schoolteacher father, The mother who had died when Nellie was 12 of a fever that swept through their county, the older brother who had gone west before her, and who she had lost touch with and worried about. She told him about Thomas Lockhart, honestly and without pretense, that she had married him because she loved him in the straightforward way that people love when they are young and hopeful, that his death had broken something in her that had taken a long time to begin to heal, that she had come to Harlan's Crossing as an act of practical survival that had become, unexpectedly, something more than survival. Roscoe told her about Missouri with more detail than he had before, about his mother, who had been a Cherokee woman from Indian Territory, who had married his father against considerable opposition from both sides and who had raised her children in the difficult intersection between two worlds that never quite stopped being hostile to each other. He told her this carefully, watching her face, because in 1874 in Texas, this was not a fact about a man's parentage that went over without consequence in every quarter. He had not told many people. The ones who mattered, he told. Nellie listened without any shift in her expression except to become more attentive. "And your mother," she said when he had finished. "Where is she now?" "She died the winter my father did," he said. "They were like that, together in everything." "That is a terrible loss," Nellie said, "but it is also a beautiful thing to be that bound to someone." "Yes," he said. He was looking at her. "It is." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked at her hands. The porch lamp put a warm light on everything, and the night air was the perfect cool of mid-October. "I should tell you," Roscoe said, "that I am not a wealthy man. I have wages and a horse and what I have saved, which is not nothing but is not a great deal either." "I did not ask about your finances," she said mildly. "I know, I am telling you anyway because you ought to have the full picture." She looked at him with something between amusement and exasperation. "Roscoe, I'm a widow with a small house and a part-time position at a general store. I'm not in a position to have concerns about anyone else's finances." He nodded, somewhat relieved. "All right. What I would have concerns about," she said more quietly, "is a man who was not honest with me, a man who was not steady." She paused. "You are honest and you are steady. Those are not small things." He reached across the distance between their two chairs and covered her hand with his. She looked at their hands for a moment, and then she turned hers over and held his, and that simple exchange, in the porch lamplight of an October evening in Harlan's Crossing, Texas, was the most significant thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. Through October he kept working on the chair. It was consuming more of his off hours than he had anticipated. Not because the work was going badly, but because he found himself refining things that did not strictly need refining, sanding a surface a second time after it was already smooth because he wanted it smoother, adjusting a joint that was already tight because he wanted it tighter. He understood that this was partly about the chair and partly about something else, partly about the fact that the chair was becoming a vessel for everything he felt about Nellie Lockhart and wanted to say to her, and did not yet know how. Old man Caldwell, who was sharp in the particular way that old men who have spent a lifetime watching other people are sharp, noticed that Roscoe was spending unusual amounts of time at his bench, and asked him one morning in late October what he was building. "A rocking chair," Roscoe said. Caldwell looked at him for a moment. "Is it for who I think it is for?" Roscoe was quiet for a beat. "Probably." Caldwell nodded slowly. He had a deep respect for Nellie Lockhart, having been one of the people who helped facilitate her becoming established in Harlan's Crossing through a quiet word to Ada Pruitt about reliable help at the store. He also had a deep respect for Roscoe Brooks, who had never once given him cause for anything else. He looked at the lean-to, at the array of shaped wood pieces visible from where they stood. "That is a lot of work for a piece of furniture," he said. "It is," Roscoe agreed. Caldwell made a sound that was the verbal equivalent of tipping his hat and walked off toward the barn, and nothing more was said about it, which Roscoe appreciated. The back slats of the chair occupied the third week of October. There were 5 of them, each one requiring a slightly different curve to fit the arc of a human back, and each one had to match the others in the quality and weight of its curve without matching exactly, the way real things match, not with the precision of a machine, but with the harmony of something made by a thoughtful hand. He carved small details into the tops of the back slats, not complex flourishes but simple, clean designs. A pattern of leaves along the top rail that he had been turning over in his mind since early October. Live oak leaves because they were the tree of this country, and because they were the first things he had seen every morning of his years in the hill country, and they had come to represent for him the particular quality of this place, its stubborn persistence and its quiet beauty. He showed no one the work in progress. He was not being secretive exactly, but there was something about the chair that felt private in a way he could not fully articulate. The way certain feelings are private not because you are ashamed of them, but because exposing them before they are ready changes what they are. The weather turned colder in the last week of October. The first real norther of the season came through on a Wednesday, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in 6 hours the way Texas northers do with spectacular rudeness. And Roscoe worked on the chair in the linta with a coat on, and a fire in the small iron brazier he kept for exactly this purpose. The wood under his hands was cool to the touch at the start of each session, and warmed gradually as he worked it. On Thursday evenings and Tuesday evenings, he continued to call on Nellie, and the courtship was progressing in the way that courtships do when both people are serious about it and neither is playing games, steadily and with increasing warmth, each visit adding something to the accumulation of what they were building together. On the last Thursday of October, as they sat on her porch with their hands linked in the way that had become natural and unremarkable between them, Nellie said something that stopped him. "Ada asked me the other day if I thought we would marry," she said. Her voice was very even, the voice she used when she was saying a difficult thing in the calmest possible manner. He turned his head and looked at her profile. "What did you say?" "I said I did not know." She paused. She gave me a look that suggested she found that a less than credible answer. He was quiet for a moment. The evening air was cold enough now that they could see their breath slightly in the lamplight. "Do you want to know what I think about it?" he asked. "I believe that is why I brought it up," she said. He gathered himself in the way he always did before he said something important, a brief inward pause that was not hesitation but precision. "I want to marry you," he said simply. "I have wanted to for a good while now. I was waiting until I felt I had something worthy to offer you." She turned to look at him fully. "Roscoe," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady now, "you have been offering me something worthy since that morning you agreed that Clayton's flour sack was light." He almost smiled. "That is a low bar." "It is not a low bar at all," she said seriously. "You could have taken Clayton's side out of male solidarity." "You did not. That told me something about you." He did turn and look at her now, really look at her, the way he had looked at her that evening in June on the storm-lit porch. She was not young in the uncomplicated way that very young people are young. She had been through things and the things had changed her, but what they had changed her into was something with depth and resilience and a particular kind of beauty that came from being real. He thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, and he had been thinking that for over a year. "I am going to ask you formally," he said. "When the time is right. I want it to be right." She searched his face. "When will it be right?" "Soon," he said. He was thinking of the chair. He was thinking of the fact that it was almost done. He was thinking of the particular conversation it was meant to be part of. Very soon. She looked at him for a long moment longer, those gray eyes reading something in his face that she seemed to find satisfactory. She nodded once and settled back in her chair and picked up the thread of the conversation they had been having before, and he looked out at the dark street of Harlan's Crossing and thought about the back slats with the live oak leaves, and felt something large and warm moving through him that he suspected was what his parents had felt for each other, that particular binding thing he had seen between them all his life and only fully understood now. November came. The hill country went into its sober November mode, not the savage cold of more northern places but a deep, still, dry cold that was its own particular character. The skies were enormous and pale blue, and the live oaks held their leaves stubbornly while everything else shed, and the mornings had a crystalline quality that made sounds carry farther and colors look cleaner than they did in other seasons. Roscoe was in the final stages of the chair. He had assembled the main structure in the last days of October, fitting the legs into the seat into the back posts, the back posts into the top rail with its carved live oak leaves, testing every joint for tightness and every angle for rightness. He had cut the armrests from a single piece of the cedar elm's limb wood, where the grain ran in a gentle curve that needed only minimal encouragement from his tools to become the smooth forward sweep of a proper chair arm. He had joined them with wooden pegs rather than nails, which took longer but was more lasting and more true. And then, in the first week of November, he fitted the rockers. He set the chair on the ground outside the lean-to in the clear morning light and sat in it. He rocked. The motion was everything it was supposed to be. Long and smooth and unhurried, a rhythm that felt like breathing, like the movement of water over stone, like something the body has always known how to do and is grateful to be reminded of. The chair did not creak. It did not wobble. The back cradled him at exactly the angle that the book had described as correct, and that he had worked to achieve for 6 weeks. He sat in it for a full 5 minutes, rocking slowly on the bare November ground outside the bunkhouse, a large weathered man in a canvas coat sitting in a beautiful small rocking chair in the dawn light, and he was so satisfied that he could not speak, which was not unusual for him but felt significant anyway. He spent the next 3 days sanding it. He went through 3 grades of sandpaper, from rough to fine to the finest he could obtain, and then he finished with a folded piece of clean canvas, and then the pad of his bare palm, which was the final word on smoothness for any well-made wooden surface. He applied 2 coats of linseed oil, letting each dry fully before the next, and the cedar elm wood came alive under the oil in a way he had hoped for but not guaranteed, a warm honey-amber color with a grain that caught the light and moved in it, deep and rich and alive-looking. He ran a small bead of dark wax along the front edge of the seat, the edge that the backs of knees would rest against when someone was seated, to soften that contact point. He waxed the armrests. He examined every joint a final time, every curve of every rocker, every taper of every leg. It was done on a Thursday in the 2nd week of November. He stood in front of it with his arms folded and looked at it for a long time. It was not the product of professional training or lifelong practice. There were places where a truly skilled furniture maker would have done differently, where the evidence of learning rather than mastery was visible if you knew what you were looking at. But it was solid, and it was beautiful, and it moved exactly as it should move, and the live oak leaves on the top rail were as fine as anything he had done with his hands in his life. He wrapped it carefully in several layers of canvas and loaded it into the wagon. He had one more thing to do before Saturday. He rode into town on Friday and went to see Reverend Hollis, who ran the church and who was also, by general community consensus, the person you spoke to about marriages, because there was no justice of the peace within 40 miles, and the Reverend's word was considered adequate for all legal and spiritual purposes in Harlan's Crossing. Reverend Hollis was a compact man of 50, with a neatly trimmed white beard and eyes that were perpetually amused in a way that did not mean he lacked seriousness, but that he had made peace with the fundamental comedy of human nature. He received Roscoe in his small office, which smelled of leather and old paper and something like tobacco, though Hollis officially did not smoke. "Roscoe," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I intend to ask Nellie Lockhart to marry me tomorrow," Roscoe said. "I wanted to let you know so that if she says yes, we can talk about arrangements." Hollis regarded him with the amused eyes. "And you have reason to believe she will say yes?" "Reasonable reason," Roscoe said. "Reasonable reason," Hollis repeated and smiled. "I like that, a man who knows but does not assume." "I do not want to assume," Roscoe said. "She is not a woman to assume about. Hollis nodded. She is not. She is a fine woman, Roscoe. One of the finest character I have encountered in many years of watching people. He leaned back in his chair. And you are a good man. I have believed that since you arrived here. He paused, and his eyes were more serious now. I know about your parentage. I have known for some time. It makes no difference to me. I want you to know that. Roscoe held his gaze. I appreciate that, Reverend. There will be people in this town who are less enlightened, Holly said quietly. I will not pretend otherwise. A man in your position knows that better than I do. I do know it, Roscoe said. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything carefully. But I also know that the people who matter in Harlan's Crossing are people I respect, and I am not willing to let the rest of them determine my life. Holly smiled again. No, I did not think you would be. He stood and extended his hand. Come see me when she says yes. On Saturday morning, Roscoe brushed his horse, put on the cleanest clothes he owned, loaded the wrapped chair into the wagon, and drove the 5 miles into Harlan's Crossing. Nellie was at home. He had not told her he was coming, which was a deviation from their usual arrangement, and when she opened her door to his knock, she looked at him with slight surprise and then at the wagon behind him in the street, at the canvas-wrapped object in the bed of it. Roscoe, she said, I was not expecting you until Tuesday. I know, he said. I had something to bring you. May I carry it in? She looked at the wagon again. Of course, she said, and stood back from the door. He went to the wagon and lifted the chair out of the bed, which he did with care, settling it against his chest with both arms. He carried it up the 2 steps of her porch and through the front door and into the small sitting room, where he set it down. It took him a moment to remove the canvas wrapping, working the knots loose with fingers that were not quite as steady as usual. When he pulled the canvas away, the rocking chair stood on Nellie Lockhart's sitting room floor in the November morning light from the window, honey amber and smooth. The live oak leaves carved along the top rail catching the light, the rocker sitting just so on her wooden floor. Nellie stood completely still and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without speaking, and he watched her face, which was doing several things at once, and he was not afraid of any of them. Roscoe, she finally said. Her voice was very quiet. You said you had always dreamed of having one, he said. That night on Ada's porch. You said it, and I thought, well, I thought that was something I could do. She walked to it slowly and put her hand on the top rail, on the carved live oak leaves, and ran her thumb along them the way he had run his thumb along the rockers the first time they were right. She bent and looked at the carving more closely. She straightened and put her hands on the armrests, and then she sat in it slowly, and when she sat in it she rocked once, and the motion was exactly as it should be, long and smooth and like breathing. She put her hands over her face. He took 2 steps toward her. Nellie, I am all right, she said from behind her hands. I am more than all right, I just need a moment. He waited. She lowered her hands. Her eyes were bright. She looked at him, and there was such a fullness in her expression, such an undisguised and complete openness, that he felt it like something physical. You made this, she said. It was not quite a question. All autumn, he said. Started in September. The wood is cedar elm from the Caldwell property. Came down in the summer storm. She looked at the chair, at her hands on the armrests, and then back at him. All autumn, she repeated softly, as though she was saying something in a language she was just learning and wanted to make sure she had the meaning right. Nellie, he said. He was standing in the middle of her sitting room in his best clothes with his hat in his hands, and he thought this was probably the most exposed he had ever been in his adult life, and it was entirely fine. It was better than fine. I am in love with you. I have been in love with you for a long time, and I have been doing my best to say so in all the ways I know how, and now I want to say it plainly. He paused. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. I want to sit on a porch with you in the evenings and talk about things until we are old. I do not have a great deal to offer you in material terms, but I will work every day for as long as I am able, and I will be honest with you, and I will be steady, and I will be here. He stopped. He was breathing somewhat harder than usual. That is what I have. She was watching him from the rocking chair with those gray eyes that saw everything, and her expression had moved entirely beyond the capacity of any conventional description. "Roscoe Brooks," she said. "Yes. That is everything," she said. "That is the whole of it. That is everything I need." She stood from the rocking chair and crossed the short distance between them and took his face in both her hands. And she kissed him, which was the first time she had kissed him. And it was the kind of kiss that is also a yes and a promise and a beginning all at once. He put his arms around her with the same care he had learned to put into everything that mattered: the fence posts and the rockers and the live oak leaves. The careful and steady attention of a man who understood that the things worth doing were worth doing all the way. They stood there in her sitting room in the November morning light, with the rocking chair behind them. And when she pulled back from the kiss she was laughing, that big unguarded laugh that always surprised her, and he was smiling in the way that he rarely smiled, fully and without reservation. And the sound of her laugh in that small, warm room was, he thought, the best sound he had ever heard. Reverend Hollis married them on the first Saturday in December, in the little church without the proper steeple, with a crowd that filled every pew and spilled out the double doors into the cold, clear morning. Ada Prout was Nellie's attendant and cried satisfyingly. Old man Caldwell sat in the front row on the groom's side and was seen to blow his nose into a handkerchief twice, which everyone pretended not to notice. Mr. Hartley and Jessie Cole, themselves recently married, sat together looking pleased with the general state of matrimony. Nellie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the 3 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, sitting at her machine in the evenings after Roscoe had gone back to the ranch, stitching it with a care that matched his care for the chair. Roscoe wore his best coat and a new white shirt and had, at Ada's insistence, visited the barber the previous afternoon, and he looked, several people remarked afterward, like the best version of himself. When Reverend Hollis asked him if he took Nellie Lockhart to be his wife, Roscoe said, "I do," in a voice that was completely steady and carried to the back of the church. When Reverend Hollis asked Nellie if she took Roscoe Brooks to be her husband, she said, "I do," in a voice that was not quite steady but was utterly certain. And the distinction between those two things was a distinction that everyone in the church understood, and that made more than one person in the pews quietly emotional. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the schoolhouse, because the schoolhouse was the largest space in Harlan's Crossing available for gatherings, and Ada and 3 other women of the town had organized food on a scale that was impressive, even by the standards of a community that took festive eating seriously. There was fiddle music and dancing, the reels and two-steps that were the social currency of a Texas community in 1874, and Roscoe danced with Nellie in a way that suggested he had learned some time ago to hide how well he danced for reasons he kept private. "You never told me you could dance," she said, as they moved through a waltz that the fiddler had played by popular request. "You never asked," he said. "I am asking now." "I can dance," he said. "My mother taught me." She said a man who could not dance was at a social disadvantage, and she intended to remove that disadvantage. He paused. She was right about most things. Nellie tightened her hand in his. "I would have liked her," she said. "She would have liked you considerably," he said. "She had very little patience for anything less than complete honesty, and you are the most honest person I have ever known." They danced through the rest of the waltz, and then through a Virginia reel that involved half the community and a great deal of cheerful chaos. And by late afternoon, when the light was going low and gold over the hills, they drove together in the wagon through the town and out the road to the ranch, where old man Caldwell had arranged for them to use the ranch house's spare room for a week while he stayed with the Prouts. He had also, Roscoe discovered when they arrived, left a fire built and a supper prepared by the cook and waiting on the stove. They stood in the kitchen of the old ranch house in the early dark of December and ate supper together for the first time as husband and wife, and talked, as they always talked, about everything and nothing, about the ceremony and the dancing and Ada's crying and what they were going to do with Nellie's house in town, and how they were going to manage the ranch arrangement with Old Man Caldwell and what they wanted their life to look like. He has been asking me for 2 years to take a more formal management role, Roscoe said, of Caldwell. I have been cautious about it because it would mean being more tied to this land and I was not sure what I wanted. And now, Nellie said, now I know exactly what I want, he said. He was looking at her in the firelight. I want to be tied to this land. I want to be here. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the same gesture from the October porch, but entirely different now, deepened by everything that had followed it. Then let us be here, she said. In the spring of 1875, Roscoe took on the formal role of ranch manager for Old Man Caldwell, who was finding the work more than his body wanted to accommodate, and who had been waiting with considerable patience for Roscoe to come to that conversation. The arrangement included a larger wage and the use of the foreman's cottage, a 2-room structure at the north end of the ranch property that was more substantial than it sounded, with good walls and a stone fireplace and windows that faced the hills. Nellie moved her things from the house in town to the cottage in early April, directing the placement of her furniture with the same decisive practicality she had brought to every logistical situation in her life. The rocking chair went on the porch of the cottage, because it was, as she said, a porch chair and deserved a porch. Roscoe agreed without reservation. He had built it for her peace, and the porch was where her peace was richest. In the evenings when the day's work was done, and the hills were going dark, and the first stars were coming out over the live oaks, they established the rhythms of their life together with the ease of 2 people who had been watching each other carefully enough that very little came as a surprise. She kept the mornings. He kept the land. They met in the middle at the end of every day on that porch, with her in the rocking chair and him on the porch rail, which remained his preferred perch in every setting, and they talked and they were quiet in turns, and they were at home in each other's company in the way that is the deepest and most lasting form of love. The summer of 1875 was hard in ways that had nothing to do with them personally. There was a drought that settled over the hill country in June and did not release it until September, and the grass went short, and the stock tanks dropped, and the price of cattle was uncertain in that particular anxious way that made every rancher in the county tense and quiet. Roscoe worked harder than he had ever worked, moving cattle to where the water was, negotiating access to a neighbor's stock pond, making decisions about the herd with an eye to the long view that Old Man Caldwell trusted entirely. There were weeks when he came home in the evenings bone-tired and dusty, and sat in the porch rail without speaking for the first 10 minutes, and Nellie let him have that silence because she understood it. And then she would say something, or he would, and the silence would become conversation, and the tiredness would become something they carried together rather than alone. In September, when the rains came back and the grass began to recover, they sat on the porch together on the first evening of rain, watching the water come down on the dry hills. "We made it through," Nellie said. "We did," Roscoe said. She rocked. The rain was soft on the roof and the live oaks were dark and moving in the wet wind. "I keep thinking about what I said that night on Ada's porch about the rocking chair being a small dream," she said. "And I think about how this is what I actually dreamed of without knowing how to say it directly. A porch and rain and someone beside me and feeling like I had come to the right place." She paused. "It was never really about the chair." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "But the chair is still good," she laughed, that big full laugh in the rain. "The chair is excellent," she agreed. He smiled and looked at the dark hills. "I have been thinking," he said, "about building onto the cottage, a proper second bedroom for when we might need it." She stopped rocking. "When we might need it," she said carefully. He turned to look at her. "If you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes that saw everything, and what they were seeing now was something she had not let herself look at directly until this moment, but that had been there for some time. "I might be more than willing," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said quietly. "I have been certain for about 2 weeks." The porch rail creaked as he came off it and crossed the 2 steps to where she sat in the rocking chair, and crouched down in front of her, and took her hands in both of his. And they looked at each other in the September rain in the way that people look at each other when something has entered their lives that is so enormous and so good that the ordinary vocabulary for happiness is completely insufficient. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was the kind of man he was. "I am more than all right," she said, which was what she had said in her sitting room on the November morning when he had given her the chair, and they both heard the echo of it, and it meant something that it was the same words. He built the second room that autumn, working on it in the evenings and on weekends with the same concentrated thoroughness he had brought to the rocking chair, though on a larger scale. Clayton Prout helped him 2 Saturdays in a row, and Mr. Hartley, who was no carpenter but was willing, held things in place while Roscoe fastened them. The room was finished by the end of November, solid and square with a south-facing window that would get morning sun. Their son was born in April of 1876 in the cottage on the Caldwell Ranch, with a midwife from town named Mrs. Graves, who was a formidable woman of great competence, in attendance. He was a healthy, substantial, loud-voiced boy, and Roscoe sat outside the door while Mrs. Graves and Nellie did their work, and was, by every account, the most still and frightened he had ever been, which was saying something, until he heard the baby cry, and the fear became something else entirely. They named him Samuel Henry Brooks, Samuel for Nellie's father and Henry for Roscoe's. Old man Caldwell, who had become genuinely fond of them both, and who spent increasing time in the pleasant company of Roscoe's family, as his own age made his solitude less comfortable, held Samuel on the day after his birth, and looked at him with the expression of a man who has seen enough hard things to know what the soft ones are worth. "That is a good boy," Caldwell said, with the same certainty he applied to his assessments of cattle and land and weather. "He is," Roscoe agreed, looking at his son in the old man's arms with a quiet pride that was entirely new in him and entirely natural, as though something that had been waiting to be activated had finally found its occasion. Nellie in the bed was watching both of them, Caldwell with the baby and Roscoe watching Caldwell with the baby, and she thought with a fullness that she could barely contain that this was what she had come west for. Not the geography, though she had come to love the hill country with a fierceness that surprised her. Not the practical survival, though she had needed that. This specific life. These specific people. This porch, this chair. This man who had spent a whole autumn carving something for her because she had said once, on a summer evening, that it was what she had always dreamed of. The town received Samuel enthusiastically. Ada Prout arrived the second day with enough food to feed the ranch for a week, and cried happily over the baby, and told Roscoe he had done something right, which made Roscoe look mildly overwhelmed and Nellie laugh from the bed. The Reverend came and blessed the child with the plain directness that was his way, and said that Samuel Henry Brooks was beginning in a good place, which was to say in a home where the love was real, and the work was honest, and the intentions were good. Roscoe sent a letter to the town in Missouri where he had grown up, to an aunt who was the last of his father's family, telling her about his marriage and his son. He was not certain the letter would find her, as they had not been in communication for several years, but he felt it was the right thing to do. 6 weeks later a reply came, 3 pages in a shaky elderly hand, full of joy about the news and full of his mother's name and his father's name, and the specific quality of a letter written by someone who had loved people you love, and was glad to know that their love had not ended with them. He read it twice, and showed it to Nellie, and she read it and held his hand and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not say better. The years that followed were not without hardship. The hill country in the 1870s was not a place that permitted complacency. The cattle market was volatile, the weather was unpredictable, and the broader changes moving through Texas in the period of Reconstruction, and its aftermath created tensions in communities that had to be navigated carefully. There were people in Harlan's Crossing who knew about Roscoe's Cherokee mother, and who held it against him with a narrowness that he had long since made his peace with. He did not fight those battles on a personal level. He could not afford to, and it would not have changed the people who were shaped that way in any lasting manner. But he also did not hide. He was Roscoe Brooks, husband of Nellie, father of Samuel, manager of the Caldwell Ranch, a man of standing in the community by virtue of what he did and how he did it, and the people of substance in Harlan's Crossing treated him accordingly. Nellie, for her part, was a woman who had a gift for the particular kind of social courage that looks like simple courtesy. She introduced her husband at every community occasion with the exact same tone and the exact same pride. She sat with Mrs. Vasquez and the other Mexican women of the area at the church social when the seating arrangements became complicated. She spoke her mind at the ladies' group meetings with a directness that was always polite and sometimes devastating. And she modeled for her son, from the time he was old enough to observe, a way of moving through the world that was decent and unbending in equal measure. Caldwell died in the spring of 1878, quietly, in his sleep, in the ranch house that had been his life's work. He had made his arrangements carefully, as was his nature, and the will that his lawyer from Fredericksburg presented to Roscoe and Nellie one April morning left the management of the ranch to Roscoe in perpetuity, with a percentage of the proceeds and the full use of the foreman's cottage for their lifetime, and expressed, in the formal legal language that was nonetheless unmistakably the old man's voice, that Roscoe Brooks was the finest ranch hand and the best sort of man he had ever known, and that leaving the Caldwell land in his care was the surest thing he had ever done. Roscoe sat with the will in his hands for a long time after the lawyer left. Nellie sat beside him at the kitchen table with her hand on his arm. He knew, Roscoe said finally. He knew exactly what he was doing, Nellie confirmed. He knew it for years. I should have told him more directly what it meant to me, Roscoe said, working for him, being trusted by him. Nellie leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. I think he knew that too, she said gently. He saw everything, that old man. He did not need you to say it. Roscoe nodded. He folded the will carefully and placed it in the tin box where they kept their important papers. He sat for a moment longer. Then he stood and went outside to start the day's work, because that was what Caldwell had taught him was the best way to honor a place you loved and a trust that had been placed in you. In the summer of 1878, Nellie discovered she was expecting again. She told Roscoe in the kitchen after supper on a warm July evening, with Samuel, who was 2 years old and vigorous and perpetually in motion, finally asleep in his small bed in the addition room. She said it with the same quiet directness she had used the first time, and Roscoe received it with the same wordless response of coming to her, and taking her hands, and looking at her with all the things he could not immediately put into language. A brother for Samuel, he said after a moment. She raised an eyebrow. You sound very certain. A sister for Samuel then, he amended. Better, she said. Their daughter arrived in February of 1879, and she was Clara Me Brooks. Clara for no particular reason except that it was a name Nellie had always loved the sound of, and Me for Caldwell's mother, whose name Roscoe had known because Caldwell had mentioned it once in the context of the portrait that hung in the ranch house parlor, an old daguerreotype of a woman in a high collar with determined eyes. Caldwell was gone, but Roscoe had thought, when the name came to him, that the old man would have liked knowing the child was named for his mother, and it had seemed right. Clara was a smaller, quieter version of her mother, watching everything from beneath dark brows, and she was the first person in the family who could make Roscoe tell extended stories by simply looking at him with an interested expression and waiting. He had not known he had extended stories until his daughter began extracting them from him at the age of 3 with this technique. Samuel, who was 3 years older than Clara and had been a considerable presence in all affairs since before he could walk, appointed himself her protector and general advocate with an intensity that made Nellie and Roscoe exchange the look of two people who have created something larger than they entirely expected. The porch was where the evenings always ended. In summer, they sat out until full dark, watching the fireflies and listening to the nighthawks. In winter, they wrapped in blankets and stayed out until the cold drove them in, because neither of them was willing to entirely give up the habit of the porch. The rocking chair was always there, on the left side of the porch where it caught the evening breeze from the hills, and Nellie was always in it, and Roscoe was always on the porch rail, and they always talked or sat in comfortable silence. And the children, as they grew, learned that the porch in the evenings was a place of particular peace that belonged to their parents, and they honored it with the inexplicable instinct that children have for the sacred geography of home. When Samuel was 7 and Clara was 4, on a September evening, Nellie sat in the rocking chair and ran her hands along the armrests the way she sometimes did when she was thinking something through, feeling the smooth cedar elm under her palms. "I was thinking today," she said, "about how a person's life is not at all what they expect it to be, and how that is the finest possible thing." Roscoe looked at her from the rail. The September evening was warm, and the hills were going gold in the last light, the same gold that had been falling across them every September of their years here, a gold that felt by now like an old friend. "Were you expecting something different?" he asked. "I was expecting Kentucky," she said. "A narrower geography, a smaller set of possibilities." She paused. "I was certainly not expecting a rocking chair that someone spent an entire autumn making for me." "You were always expecting the chair," he said. "You told me so yourself. You dreamed about it." "I dreamed about what the chair meant," she said. "Not the chair exactly." She looked at him. "Though the chair is wonderful." "I know you love the chair," he said with genuine satisfaction. "I love the chair," she agreed. "And I love the man who made it. And I love that boy in there and that girl in there and this porch and this sky and these hills." She was quiet for a moment. "I love this life, Roscoe." He looked at her in the September gold in her rocking chair, with her gray eyes that saw everything turned fully on him. He thought about the flour sack in August of 1873, and the Saturday in September when she had found him at the lean-to bench, and the November morning in her sitting room when she had put her hands over her face, and every porch evening in between, and all the porch evenings still ahead of them stretching out through the years, the way the hill country stretched out from the Caldwell property toward the horizon, open and full of weather and impossible beauty. "I love this life too," he said. It was, as always, entirely true and entirely insufficient, and also, as always, exactly enough. The rocking chair went on living its life on the porch of the foreman's cottage on the Caldwell ranch, and over the years it acquired the marks of living. There were slight darknesses on the armrests where generations of hands had rested, a tiny deepening of the wood at the very peak of one of the live oak leaves on the top rail, where a small finger had worried at it repeatedly, a smoothness on the seat that went beyond what Roscoe's sanding had achieved, a smoothness produced by years of use, by the warmth of the human body, and the particular friction of a life in motion. Clara, at age 6, asked her father to show her how to carve. He brought her a piece of cedar elm from the woodpile, smaller than her fist, and a small knife that he had blunted slightly to be safer, and sat beside her on the porch steps and showed her how to make a cut that followed the grain, how to hold the wood and how to hold the knife, how to take away only what needed to be taken away and leave everything else. She spent 4 evenings making, with great concentration and her mother's particular stubborn focus, a small leaf shape that was not much like a leaf but was entirely itself, and presented it to her father with the gravity of one artist acknowledging another. Roscoe held the small carved thing in his large palm and looked at it with complete seriousness. "This is good work," he said. Clara studied him to see if he was being honest or kind, which was already a quality in her at 6 that suggested her mother's influence. She seemed to find him honest. She nodded and went back to whatever she had been doing. Samuel, who was 10, watched this exchange from the porch rail where he had taken to sitting, which everyone had been expecting for years, and said nothing, because he was, by this point in his life, visibly his father's son in manner and silence and the particular quality of his attention. In the spring of 1885, when the children were 9 and 12 respectively, Roscoe had occasion to travel to San Antonio on ranch business, a cattle sale of some consequence that required his presence for 3 days. He wrote to Nellie every evening from the hotel, letters that were short and practical by the standards of romantic correspondence, but that contained, between the lines of accounts of prices and conversations with buyers, a consistent and specific longing to be home that any reader could have identified without difficulty. She wrote back every evening too, from the porch after the children were in bed, by lamplight, letters longer than his and full of what the children had done, and what the hills looked like in the spring evenings, and what she had thought about at various points in the day. In one letter she described sitting in the rocking chair in the lamplight after putting the children to bed and feeling, in the motion of it, the particular quality of his absence, the way a chair built by someone's hands carries the memory of those hands forever. He kept that letter in the tin box with the important papers for the rest of his life. The cattle sale was successful, which mattered, and he came home on the evening of the 3rd day riding hard because he had pressed the horses and himself to arrive before full dark. He came over the last ridge as the sun was going down over the hills, and below him he could see the light on the cottage windows and the small figure on the porch, and even from that distance, and in that light he could see the motion of the rocking chair. He rode down through the live oaks with the autumn last light on his shoulders and the best part of his life waiting for him on the porch below, and he thought about the September morning 11 years prior when he had set the chair on the ground and sat in it for the first time in the early light outside the lean-to and rocked, and known it was right. It had been right. Every day since had confirmed it. The chair and the woman and the life they had built together and the children who carried them both forward into the future, all of it was right, with the rightness not of perfection but of truth, the rightness of a thing made with care and honesty by a man who knew what he was working toward. He came into the yard and put his horse up and crossed to the porch, and Nellie rose from the chair to meet him, and he held her for a moment with the evening falling around them, and the hills going dark and the first stars beginning their work overhead. "You are home," she said. "I am home," he said. They stood there for a moment longer, and then she took his hand and led him inside where the children were already awake and loud, and demanding supper and the story of the cattle sale with every possible detail. And the cottage was warm and full, and alive with everything that it had become. And outside on the porch the rocking chair moved slightly in the evening breeze, as if it remembered who had sat in it. In the years that followed, Harlan's Crossing grew and changed in the way that small Texas towns grow and change in the 1880s, slowly and then, with a sudden acceleration when the railroad came through to the county seat 12 miles east, and the world felt closer and larger than it had before. Roscoe managed the Caldwell Ranch with the same steady competence he had always brought to it, and the ranch prospered, and their circumstances improved accordingly. He hired on 2 hands in 1883, young men whom he trained with the same patience his father had used on him at the woodworking bench, showing the principle before the technique, explaining the why before the how. Nellie went back to teaching. She had a teacher's education and Harlan's Crossing School needed, by 1882, someone more formally trained than the succession of visiting schoolteachers the town had been cycling through since Mr. Hartley had moved his family to Fredericksburg. She taught there 3 days a week and managed the household the other 4, and did both with such thoroughness that it sometimes exhausted the people watching her, though it seemed, genuinely, not to exhaust her. Samuel proved to be brilliant with the land in the particular way his father was brilliant with it, intuitive and patient, and able to read the silent language that landscape speaks to people willing to listen. By the time he was 14, He was working alongside Roscoe on weekends with the genuine usefulness of someone who belonged there. And the father and son sight of them moving across the ranch land in the early mornings, reading the same fences and the same grasses and the same cattle with the same quality of attention, was one of those images that people in the community stored away without being consciously aware of doing it. Clara was brilliant with words, with the same love of reading that Nellie had inherited from her schoolteacher father, and passed along without needing to try. By 12, she was reading her way through everything available in Harlan's Crossing, and had begun writing, in a small journal Roscoe had given her for her 10th birthday, stories and observations and descriptions of the hill country in all its seasonal variations that had a maturity and vividness that made Nellie, who read them only when invited, feel the specific pride of a teacher in a student who has surpassed them. On a December evening in 1886, the whole family was on the porch. It was a mild December, the kind that the hill country produces occasionally as if in apology for the harder winters, and the evening was cool but not cold, the kind of evening that invites the porch rather than forbidding it. Nellie was in the rocking chair. Samuel, at 11, was on the porch rail in the exact position his father had occupied at every porch occasion of his life. Clara, at 8, was on the top porch step with her journal open on her knees, writing something with great concentration. Roscoe stood at the edge of the porch looking at the hills in the last of the light, and he was aware with a particular and full awareness of exactly what he had, standing there, with the hills and the live oaks and the smell of cedar in the cool air, and his family arranged in the lamplight behind him in the postures of a life well lived. He turned and looked at Nellie in the rocking chair. She was watching him because she was always watching him, those gray eyes still and clear. She smiled, that real smile, the one that had stopped him since the flour sack morning in 1873, and had not stopped stopping him in the 13 years since. He crossed the porch and sat on the porch rail beside where Samuel had made room for him without being asked, and he looked at his son on one side of him and his wife in the chair and his daughter writing on the step, and the peace of it, the tremendous and unhurried peace of it, was as good as anything he had ever known. "Clara," Samuel said, "what are you writing?" "A story," Clara said without looking up. "About what?" "About how Papa made the chair," she said, still writing. "Mama told me about it and I want to write it down properly so it does not get lost." There was a pause on the porch. Nellie looked at Roscoe. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was beyond translation and did not need to be translated. "That is a good story to write down," Roscoe said to his daughter. Clara looked up at him with her mother's gray eyes. "I know," she said seriously. "It is the best story I know." She went back to writing. Samuel looked at his father and then at the chair and then at his mother, following some private chain of reasoning that arrived at a conclusion he seemed satisfied with, and then he looked out at the hills with his father's eyes and his father's quiet. The rocking chair moved. The live oak leaves on the top rail caught the lamplight. The hill country dark came in from the east the way it always did, softly and completely, and the stars above Harlan's Crossing came out one by one, and the family on the porch was held in all of it, in the dark and the light and the cold evening air, and the long, deep history of what it meant to love someone so well that you spent a whole autumn giving them proof of it in the only language you fully knew. The years would continue. Samuel would grow into a man of standing and substance, running the Caldwell Ranch with his father's skill, and eventually with his own family beside him. Clara would become a woman of letters, a teacher like her grandmother's grandfather, with 3 children of her own who would grow up hearing the story of the rocking chair the way some children grow up hearing folk tales, as a kind of essential narrative about what love looks like when it is true. Roscoe and Nellie would grow old together in the cottage on the hill country ranch, and the porch would always have the chair, and the evenings would always find them there in their accustomed places, talking about things and being quiet in turns, and watching the seasons move across the hills that had become as intimate to them as breathing. The chair would outlast them both, as fine-made things made with love tend to do. It would be on the porch of the same cottage where it had always been, and it would carry in its grain and its smooth worn surfaces the accumulated warmth of every evening they had sat in it, and every story that had been told, and every moment of that particular porch peace that they had promised each other, and delivered, without fail, through all the years of a life that turned out to be everything either of them had dreamed of, and more, and exactly right. And on the top rail, the carved live oak leaves would still catch the light, just as they had on the November morning in 1874, when Roscoe Brooks carried them into Nellie Lockhart's sitting room wrapped in canvas and left them there on the floor of her life, solid and smooth and rocking, as the best kind of promise does, perfectly and without end.